Hi, everybody. Today's Friday, August 15th, 2025, and our friends, Trita Parsi and Ambassador Chas Freeman, are back with us. Welcome back.
Good to
Thank
be with
you.
you.
Scott, Trita, let's start with you and with your new article in the Foreign Policy. I was talking with my guests here on this podcast about your article because I found it so much important to be considered. The title is The Next Israel Iran War is Coming. And what are you trying? What are the crucial points that you're making in this article that you believe that the war is coming?
Thank you, Nima. Thank you for your kind words, and always great to be back with you and with Chaz. So, what I'm arguing in this article is that there is a very high likelihood of Israel restarting the war, and that can happen as soon as end of this month, but probably the window will start closing by December of this year because the US enters the midterm elections. I don't argue that that is a prohibitive factor, but it does complicate matters significantly. We can go into greater detail. The reason I think the war will restart with high likelihood is because Israel only achieved half of three of its, actually, one out of three, but even that one objective that they had with this war was only partially achieved. The three objectives that the Israelis had with this war was, first of all, to get the United States into a direct military confrontation with Iran. That was successful, but only partially. Partially because the Israelis have for more than 20 years tried to get this to happen, but not as a one off, but rather as a sustained campaign by the United States as a full participant in the war to really bomb much of Iran and reduce Iran's power, shift the balance in the region in Israel's favor in a manner that only the United States can do, Israel cannot achieve on its own. It was a partial success because for the first time, the United States actually did directly bomb Iran. But Trump did it only as a one off. He did not, in fact, the administration believes, or their intent appears to have been, to do something to end the war rather than to escalate. And this was highly disappointing to the Israelis. And I think a key reason as to why the Israelis ultimately agreed to a ceasefire. It's because they were starting to take significant hits from the Iranians towards the end of the war. They would have been happy, I think, in absorbing those hits as long as the US was in the war. But if the US no longer was in the war, then it didn't make any sense. The cost benefit analysis shifted, and the Israelis agreed to a ceasefire. So it was a partial success. The two other objectives were failures. One was to decapitate the regime. And I use the word regime specifically. I saw that last time some people were not happy that I said the regime. The regime, because I'm not talking about decapitating the Pezeshkian government. It's about the regime as a whole. And here again, the Israelis initially had some very significant successes. They managed to take Iran completely by surprise, killed 20 or plus very senior officials, military officials inside the Iranian regime, and including a large number of scientists, including, of course, their families and children, neighbors. It was a significant amount of civilian deaths that largely has been ignored in the Western media. But they never managed to disrupt Iran's command and control for more than a few hours. Within 12 hours, the Iranians had replaced those individuals and then started shooting back very large number of missiles and drones. And since then, the control of the government never was lost throughout the entire 12 days. And we also did not see a scenario in which the people of Iran, despite the fact that I think by and large the regime is very unpopular, nevertheless, they did not take out on the streets. On the contrary, you saw a major wave of nationalism, which to a large extent is not just because the country was bombed, that's a natural reaction, but also because the manner in which it was bombed. This happened in the midst of negotiations, 2 days before a new round. This was extremely deceptive, dishonest, and with very little regard for civilian casualties. The Iranians have reported more than 1,060 deaths in just 12 days. We saw entire apartment buildings being blown up by the Israelis. We also, incidentally, the Israelis themselves reported that they had blown up 5 car bombs in the middle of the day in Tehran. If the Iranians blew up 5 car bombs in Tel Aviv, the Western media, by and large, and quite correctly, would have called that terrorism. That was never the way it was described in the Western media, to the extent that they even covered the fact that the Israelis themselves said that they were blowing off car bombs. But they never managed to create a scenario in which people took to the streets. On the contrary, I think the distance between the regime and the Iranian society has shrunk as a result of this attack, at least in the short term. Whether that will be a long-term phenomenon or not remains to be seen. The third objective, which is the most important objective of the Israelis, is to reduce Iran into a new Lebanon or Syria, a country that Israel can bomb at will, with impunity, and without American involvement. At this point, clearly, they can't do anything without American involvement. This is not something that I think the Israelis had counted on achieving in the first round. I do think, however, they had counted to achieve much more than what they did. The Iranians, of course, understand this, and it's critical for them, from their standpoint, to make sure that they dispel the notion that Iran can be reduced to another Syria and that they can fall under Israel's military hegemony. This leads me to believe that A, the Israelis will attack relatively soon, because once they have started this, they cannot afford, from their standpoint, to allow Iran to rebuild its air defense missile systems or even buy new and better ones, even though, of course, that will take some time. So once they've started the clock, they cannot pause for too long, otherwise things will start to become very difficult for them. And that's in addition to the political clock, which is that after the midterms, the likelihood of being able to drag the US into this will probably be a more complicated calculation. But this also means that from the Iranian standpoint, if they want to dispel the Israelis from the notion that they ever can succeed with this, they cannot play the long game in the manner that they have done in the past. Even in this 12-day war, the Iranians did not shoot off the largest amount of their missiles. They paced themselves. They thought that this was going to be a long conflict, and they wanted to make sure that they could win in the long run. Now I think it's become more clear to them they have to strike back much harder, much sooner, with a larger number of missiles in order to immediately inflict pain, so that the cost-benefit analysis on the Israeli side changes and they recognize that Iran is too large, too powerful to be subjected to that type of air dominance and the type of a mowing of the grass strategy that the Israelis have for more or less the entire region at this point. This leads me to believe that the next war not only will happen relatively soon, but it will also be much bloodier than the previous war. What the US does in all of this is going to be absolutely decisive. Trump showed an ability to say no to the Israelis, at least in a limited way, much more so than Biden ever did. Even the first ceasefire would never have happened had it not been for the pressure that the Trump administration put on the Israelis behind the scenes, even before he had entered the White House. What he has not shown, however, is an ability to sustain that no. The Israelis, according to one official I spoke to in the administration, are relentless and they keep on pushing. And eventually, Trump loses patience and he caves in. If he does that again in the next wave, and this is very important, I think, to understand, it is not going to be the same as the last war. 12 days, limited strikes by the US, or at least limited in sorties, and something that he can just say, this was not a war, this was just military action. On the contrary, I think it will be much larger, much bloodier, and the Iranians are likely not going to respond politely to the US as they did when they struck the base in Doha. And I use the word politely because that is what one Pentagon official called it. Rather, it will be a much, much larger war. And this will have completely different political ramifications for Trump. He survived the intra-Republican fighting, some call it a civil war, between the Lindsey Graham wing and the restrainer wing, who don't want to get the US involved in more wars. To the extent that some people in Washington are saying, look, this, MAGA is going to be with Trump regardless. This was not costly to him. I think that's a misread. I think what happened here is that, first of all, this is only 6-7 months into the president's term. So he has a lot of maneuverability and capital that he will not have a year from now. But more importantly, this was, at the end of the day, from the American standpoint, a one-off. And that he can probably get away with once. A war in which you suddenly start having American body bags coming home, I don't think will be tolerated. In fact, the decibel of protests against Trump from his own base against this war is actually quite impressive and much, much larger than any protest we saw from the Democratic side against Biden on any policy he had within the first 6 or 7 months of his term. So I do think that just looking at this as a snap picture and thinking, well, it worked out well for Trump this time around, he can do it again and he can do more of it, is a complete miscalculation. If this leads to a large war, which I think it will be, if the US enters it and allows the Israelis to go at it again, then I think it will cost them tremendously politically, and that will have immediate impact on the midterm elections.
Yeah. Ambassador, jump in, your take.
Well, I think that's a brilliant and logical political analysis, but let me introduce some questions. I think the major questions are about Israeli capabilities, because at the end of the last round, and I agree with you, Trita, both sides are preparing for another round, and I agree with you that it will be more savage, at least on the Iranian side, than it was during the last round, if it happens. But the Israelis basically were running out of an interception capability. The Iranians slow-rolled their response. They got rid of a lot of their older weapons first in an effort to attrit the defenses, which they actually succeeded in doing. The Israelis learned, among other things, that two things, I suppose. One is that without the assistance of the United States and others, United Kingdom, they really cannot defend themselves against Iran. Second, and that support, although it is likely, is not certain. The second, more importantly, perhaps, they learned that the United States does not have the production capacity, nor do they have it, to rapidly replenish what was expended. 25% of US THAAD defenses were exhausted in these 12 days. The United States has other priorities, although it does tend to give primacy to the Israeli issue. So I think there are military physical constraints here, which have to be taken into account without at all questioning Trita's projection of Israeli intent. I doubt the capability to do it on the timescale that he suggests. I think, finally, there are two other elements, one of which has taken President Trump today to Anchorage for a meeting with President Putin, start in a few hours. And that is the pursuit of a Nobel Peace Prize, preposterous as that may seem, and valueless as the Peace Prize may have become after having been awarded to President Obama just because he was a nice fellow they wanted to meet in Oslo. I think Trump, he really, I give Vladimir Putin credit yesterday for saying what he did, that Trump is, energetically and sincerely pursuing peace. I would add, however, he has no idea how to achieve peace. But I don't question his sincerity and his ambition with respect to the Nobel Prize. I think, Trita, you, at the end of your really quite brilliant monologue, you brought up the question of MAGA support. And I think really it's extraordinary that some of the founding figures in that movement, which of course is a personality cult, but which has had other elements to it, Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, people like that, are openly critical of Trump, as are others, for getting us into forever wars. I don't think they are yet agitated about the forever trade war that he has started, because that's not going to end. And most economists seem to believe that we're about to experience a major wave of inflation as a result of his arbitrary and capricious slapping down of tariffs. So I think popular support is rapidly diminishing, and diminishing not just in the general public, but among his most ardent supporters. Of course, a final comment is that he has surrounded himself with sycophants and ignoramuses. He's gone off to Anchorage. There's not a single person in his entourage with any qualifications to talk about either the military situation on the ground in Ukraine or the broader issues of peace in Europe. And it's very clear that, as was the case with Iran, when we were talking to Iran, there was no common understanding of what was at stake and what the agenda was. So I think there will be no rabbit pulled out of a hat. I think the Israelis indeed are quite as ferocious as Trita projects them to be, but I wonder about their capabilities, and I wonder about the desire of the Trump administration to back yet another forever war, which is what it would be.
Could I comment quickly, Nima?
Go ahead, Trita.
Yeah, no, I think Chaz, of course, is absolutely right. There is a military logistical dimension here that may not work out well with this political timeline that I'm pointing out to. But part of the reason why I still land on the belief that there likely will be some form of attack by the Israelis is that if they wait too long, the opening that they themselves believe is critical as to why they could do this in the first place, which is that much of the axis of resistance has been weakened, and the attacks from last October, when much of Iran's S-300 air defense system was taken out. This created an opening that did not exist before, that was a driving force behind them thinking that this is something they need to do now. If they wait too long, despite these the military logistical factors, then it's not as if the time is on their side. However difficult it is now, given potential limitations they have, it will be even more difficult 3 months later. And this is the factor that I think will move them to do this sooner rather than later, even though they may not at all have the readiness and preparedness to be able to pull it off. Another factor that is also important, I do address it in the article, is a critical reason as to why they had some limited success, at least in the beginning, was because of the Mossad assets that they had inside of Iran, which of course took everyone by surprise. And I think it's something that should raise significant questions as to why the Iranian government has been arresting so many dual citizens, whereas in reality, there's been plenty of Mossad agents roaming around inside of Iran. Now, if they had been in the country for a longer period of time, then there's a likelihood that the Mossad has essentially consumed those assets and it will not be able to reuse them in a future attack. However, there's some reporting that suggests that these are assets that were moved into the country about 3 days before the attack. If that is the case, then there's also a scenario in which once again, they may be able to pull off something inside the country. And it's not clear yet that the Iranian authorities actually have been able to truly root out those elements. They've arrested apparently up to 20,000 people, but the borders remain still very porous, particularly in the Kurdistan region and in Baluchistan, and that is apparently where many of them entered into the countries. So there's still a lot of unknowns, and Chaz is absolutely right. And I agree, and may very well end up being that they don't have the full military capability. I suspect that they will still, because of these other factors, start the war, despite the fact that they're not fully ready to be able to pull it off in the manner that they would like to.
Let me add two factors, if I may. First, reinforcing Trita's sense that the Israelis feel a sense of urgency. I don't think anyone knows what Iran is doing with the enriched uranium it apparently kept successfully, some of it anyway, despite the Israeli and American attacks. It would be very logical for the Iranians to be reprocessing that, processing that as rapidly as they could to reduce the time between their ability to make a decision about building a bomb and actually building one. So I suspect that the Israelis may themselves suspect that time is not on their side in terms of Iranian nuclear latency, and that they need to act sooner rather than later in accordance with the three objectives that Trita outlined. The second factor, which is a wild card, is the Azerbaijan-Armenia transport corridor, which runs right along the border with Iran, and which is correctly seen by the neoconservatives and the pro-Armenian element in the United States as flanking Iran on the north. Both Russia and Iran have objected vociferously to this corridor, which means to me that it's very unlikely to have much of a half-life. But there it is. And perhaps people from Mossad and from Amman came into Iran via Baluchistan in part, but they certainly came in from Azerbaijan. And the attacks on Iran, in fact, in some cases were staged from Azerbaijan. So I think this is another wild card. What happens on that ridiculously named transport corridor? It's the Trump Primrose Path to Heaven or something. But whatever it is, I wonder whether that is not a major factor in the thinking of countries in the region, including Israel.
Trita, I think you're talking in your article, talking about the sustainability of the U.S. support to Israel. And we know that during the war between Iran and Israel, the United States wasn't capable of providing Ukraine with the weapons that they need. They somehow stopped sending weapons and aid to Ukraine. That is a very important issue in the meeting between the two presidents. Do you think that would, if they achieve something with Russia, that would influence the decision on the part of the United States and Israel to attack Iran again?
I think it will be indirect if there is any direct, if there is any influence. Obviously, when it comes to the ability to add more air defense systems to Israel, this is a limited capacity that the U.S. has. It's already in a situation in which its own troops, force protection in other areas of the world are suffering, not just because of Ukraine, but primarily because of Israel. I mean, as Chaz pointed out, 25% of the THAAD interceptors consumed in 12 days in a region that Trump, as well as the previous administration, believes no longer is vital to the United States. That doesn't seem to be a particularly smart move. Moreover, it's going to take the United States 3 to 5 years, estimate, to be able to replenish that. So this is ultimately not a game that can be played in the long run for the Israelis. I think the political fatigue in the United States is going to kick in. But the Israelis believe, I mean, it's very important to understand how they view their own security doctrine, which I think is very different from any other country in the world. Most countries believe that threats is something that is essentially capability times intent. Just because a country has the capability does not necessarily mean that they're a threat unless they have a threatening intention. The Israelis, and this is based on what Israeli generals themselves have explained to me, believe that because of their own experience, they cannot afford to assume that threat is not always present. They believe that threat is always there. They have to assume so. And as a result, they focus only on capacity. And this is why it doesn't matter if Iran, not to say that if Iran had a different rhetoric on Israel, etc., it wouldn't have some impact. But I believe that fundamentally, the fact that Iran has the capacity of being able to challenge Israel, that Israel cannot deter Iran, is something that is unacceptable to the Israelis. And the minute it looked as if the Israelis were successful with Iran earlier on, see how they shifted their focus towards Turkey, particularly mindful of Turkey's success in Syria. Now suddenly they were talking about Turkey as being the new threat in the region. And so this is an endless process for them. There will essentially not be any point in which there will be satisfaction. If you look back in the 1960s and 70s, Iran and Israel actually had very close relations. It wasn't just because of the intent, it was because back then the Iranians did not have the capacity of reaching Israel. So the region was much larger back then. Technology has made the region much smaller. Now, countries that in the past the Israelis wouldn't have to care about in terms of capacity, now they do. And this is constantly going to put them in a position of some form of a confrontation. But they're not the ones paying for it. It's the United States that is paying the vast majority of it. In fact, I believe it was CRS itself that came out with an analysis that showed that the United States paid for roughly 35% of Israel's entire military budget last year. And to the best of my knowledge, that did not include the cost of the April and October air defense systems and the interceptors that were consumed there, which apparently is more than $2 billion. So I think there might be some new analysis coming out that takes into account the 12 days and everything else. And I think that number will be even higher than 35%. So this is an unusual situation. A country that essentially has a security doctrine that says it has to be the military hegemon of the region in order for it to be safe. But the cost of its hegemony is going to be paid for by someone else. I don't think we have other historical parallels to this at all. Chaz would probably know better.
No, I don't think there are other cases of this. I would like to reinforce your points. Israel basically demands absolute security for itself, which means absolute insecurity for everyone else. There are, of course, two ways to deal with threats. The more efficient, least costly way is through diplomacy, by eliminating the cause of the threat or by modulating it or moderating it. Israel does not practice diplomacy in that sense. It's very Trumpian in its bluster, belligerence, and bullying, and it does not persuade. This despite the fact that Israeli business people, by and large, in my experience, are very personable and persuasive, but their government is not. The idea of Israeli diplomacy is an oxymoron. Final point here is that if you don't practice diplomacy, you are left with nothing but military action. And not just deterrence, which is often the American version of this, because the Israelis don't believe in deterrence. They believe in destruction of the capabilities of the other side. So this makes Israel the most dangerous state on the planet in terms of its neighbors and in terms of predicting its actions, because it will do things that in the long run guarantee hatred and enmity by others without regard to that. Everything it does is tactical, but it fits into a strategic context of leveling the entire neighborhood. And I very well remember in 1993, as Assistant Secretary of Defense, going to Israel and sitting through a briefing by a most unfortunate, unhappy Israeli colonel about why Iran was a monster and had to be destroyed. This was, of course, after the essential destruction of Iraq as a potential enemy of Israel. And it was perfectly obvious that he didn't believe a word he was saying. But Israel suffered from enemy deprivation syndrome, and it had to find a new enemy, and it did in Iran. And so there's no halt to this. If Israel subdues Iran, it will go after Turkey, as many have already said. This is a security threat to everybody in the region and beyond it.
Trita, not only Turkey, I would argue Pakistan would be one of the targets if they can do something with Iran. But when it comes to the Israeli-American attack on Iran, how do you feel about this strategy on the part of Iranian? How did it influence the Iran's strategy in a long run? Because the Iranian society didn't experience a direct war since the Iran-Iraq war. This was something new. We didn't know about the outcome, how it would influence the Iranian society. How do you see in the leadership of Iran the strategic mindset of Iranian government in the aftermath of those attacks?
I think there's been some very interesting things that have happened. First of all, I think within society, there was always a very strong skepticism in certain quarters about Iran's regional approach, believing that Iran was wasting money in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and other places, unnecessarily entangling Iran in conflicts that it should not be involved in. And as a result, much of the challenges and the problems Iran had was of its own making because of a policy of interfering in other countries' affairs, getting itself entangled in this conflict with Israel, for instance. I'm not saying that there's been a dramatic shift everywhere, but I think there has been something important that has occurred, which is precisely because this attack happened in such a deceptive way, in the midst of negotiations, at a time when the Iranians were sending every possible signal that they actually wanted to make a deal with the United States, from articles in Financial Times to op-eds in Washington Post by the Iranian foreign minister, even signaling things that they had never agreed to before, which was they're open to having American companies come back into Iran, open to having American companies investing in Iran, talking about $1 trillion business opportunity for the United States. This was completely off the table in 2013 to 2015 when the JCPOA was being negotiated. So it was very clear this was a genuine effort to get a deal. And then in the midst of that, at a point in which perhaps that last meeting in Muscat would have actually led to a deal, the Israelis attack. And I think this made people understand that perhaps this picture is a little bit more complicated. Not to say that Iran is completely innocent in any way, shape, or form, but recognizing that perhaps the Israelis have a different type of a calculation, that it actually isn't an issue about the nuclear program. It's that what they're really fearing more than anything else is precisely that the US and Iran would resolve the nuclear conflict and actually move towards a more positive direction together. That is the biggest threat to the Israelis. And as a result, they were attacking. Moreover, a criticism that you see now increasingly is not why did Iran invest in the Axis, but rather why was the Axis not there? Why didn't it perform in the manner that it should? So perhaps it was a wasted investment, but not because the idea behind it necessarily was wrong, but because it didn't work out. The idea, the concept of it itself of having some form of a forward defense that prevents the conflict from reaching Iran's own territory, I think has gotten a completely different lease on life. Whether it's feasible for them to achieve it now or no is a completely different issue. This, again, it goes back to what I said earlier on, the distance between society and the regime as a whole, I think has shrunk a bit. Whether that is sustainable or not depends on how the government acts right now. There is an opportunity for national reconciliation. It is the government that has to lead that effort. Never before has there been such an openness from society to go in this direction with the government. But I think also from pure self-preservation, the regime would probably recognize that had it not been for the unpopularity of the regime itself, the degree to which the Mossad was successful in recruiting Iranians to become agents for the Mossad inside the country would simply have not been there. So one of the most effective ways of preventing that from happening again is to, again, make sure that that degree of unhappiness is addressed. And that cannot be a superficial measure. It cannot be just superficial reforms. It has to be far more profound than that.
Yeah. I agree that reform is the best defense against disloyalty. But whether that government can carry out significant reforms remains to be seen, I believe. Just two very short comments. First, the stripping away of the forward defense provided by links to Hezbollah and the Syrian Assad government, as well as the relationship with the Houthis, who continue to be a thorn in the side of Israel and the United States. The stripping away of this, of course, ironically makes the case for a nuclear defense of Iran much stronger. What is Iran now to rely upon in order to defend itself against a predatory and ruthless Israel and the United States. The people who constantly cite the North Korean example, and I think it's apposite. Second point is, just as I think from looking at the composition of the Russian delegation to Anchorage, the Russians may have misjudged their ability to bribe President Trump with business opportunities. The Iranians made the same mistake. He is indeed bribable, I believe, as he has shown in multiple contexts, but he is a prisoner of the Zionist lobby. His donors direct his actions. He is surrounded by people who do not think the way he does about war and peace. And so there's a limit to what can be done by dangling business opportunities in front of him. In any event, all of that is in the past, because I believe the animosity between Iranians and Americans is now very intense, understandably. And the famously pro-American attitude of many Iranians is probably withered on the vine. I haven't been to Iran for a very long time, so I hesitate to make any judgment about that. But I'd like to hear Trita's views on that subject.
No, I think you're quite right. I think we're seeing, particularly amongst the younger generation, first of all, you have a generation that became quite apathetic, who were very disappointed that reform did not yield the changes that they were hoping for, and then turned towards the idea of revolution. And then in 2022, that failed, even though in many ways culturally the country has been revolutionized in the sense that the hijab is not at all being enforced in the manner that it was before. But nevertheless, it didn't bring down the structure of the regime at all. So they've kind of gone back into apathy, having no real theory of change at this point. But within the elements of a younger, not that age, but 30 and up, you're seeing a large number of folks within the security establishment who were very critical of Iran's approach in the first place, but not in the direction of thinking that Iran was wasting money in Lebanon or in Syria, but rather critical because they believed that this strategy of strategic patience was an erroneous one that was constantly enabling the Israelis to move closer and escalate further and further with Iran, because Iran was never really inflicting sufficient pain and cost on the Israelis when they were doing this. So I think you're seeing some changes happening inside the security apparatus as well, partly because many people have been killed. So if there are folks in the West who are hoping that the next generation will come in and they will have a different attitude towards the West, I think that may be true, but not in the direction that they believe. I think this is one in which perhaps the population has not warmed up to some of the leadership of the country, but they have grown much, much more suspicious and lost perhaps some of their innocence when it comes to their perspective of the United States and the West as a whole. And I would add here, very importantly, not that they're a major factor any longer, but Europe. Europe is no longer seeing what it was before, particularly after the German chancellor came out and said that Israel is doing Europe's dirty work for it. And I think this is a dramatic shift that I don't think we've really paid enough attention to.
Interesting.
The entire constellation of the E3 was something that was created back in 2003 by the Europeans because they were fearful that the United States under George Bush would go after Iran after having had invaded Iraq.
Yes.
And they created this constellation to try to interject themselves diplomatically in order to avoid war. In fact, in Europe, it was controversial because countries such as Spain and Italy and Poland were like, hold on, are we being relegated to being second-rate European powers if France, Germany, and the UK suddenly put themselves at the top in this E3 constellation? So this was, for a very long time, not accepted by other Europeans, but nevertheless, it was there to prevent war. Now we have a situation in which the E3 seems to mostly be concerned about whether they're even at the table or not, whether they're relevant or not. And instead of coming out and condemning what clearly was a violation of international law, the Germans, which were seen as the most dovish of the three before, came out and said that Israel is actually doing the bidding, the dirty work of Europe. This has just completely changed the situation. And I think, and this is something that, of course, is also affecting the perspective of the Iranian people vis-a-vis Europe.
May I ask a question, Trita? How prevalent do you believe buyer's remorse is with regard to the ceasefire in Iran? I know it was criticized because many Iranians, I think, correctly judged that they were winning the conflict in relative terms, inflicting far more damage on Israel than it had expected or than it could cope with, and exhausting its defenses. And so there was initial criticism, well, why are we winding down this thing instead of continuing it? How prevalent is that sentiment, do you think?
I can't put a number on it, but I agree with you. You definitely hear those voices who said that perhaps it was a mistake, that Iran should have continued, that Israel was running out of air defense interceptors, and as a result, Iran could have scored a bit bigger victory, essentially, rather than what I think at the end of the day is an indecisive outcome. But I think that's only taking one variable into account, which is the fact that the Israelis started to not have the ability to protect themselves against Iranian missiles. It doesn't take into account other factors. One being that at the end of the day, the Israelis were not targeting Iran's ability to export energy. It was mostly targeting Iran's oil fields that would affect its domestic consumption. And this was probably because they didn't want to shoot up oil prices, because that would be problematic for the US. But it also means that as a result, there were a lot of things the Israelis probably could have done that they didn't do. Moreover, the Israelis were not using their long-distance missiles in this war. So that had not entered into the equation. Moreover, Trump was very eager to close this and actually get a deal. And we saw how angry he was when it looked like as if the Israelis were restarting the war. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen a president so angrily drop the F-bomb, particularly not in the context of Israel, publicly. I'm sure privately it happens quite often, but publicly. What would it have done to the US's attitude towards this? Would Trump just completely have withdrawn himself from it? Or would he have been pushed into actually getting involved in the war much more so? So I think the isolated variable that says, yes, perhaps the Iranians actually were starting to inflict more damage on Israel than Israel was inflicting on Iran towards the end of the war. And as a result, just looking at it from that perspective was a mistake to agree to a ceasefire. Nevertheless, does not take into account many, many other factors that would probably have changed if the war had continued, and would perhaps not at all have been to the favor of Iran.
Both sides have the capacity to escalate beyond where they did. That is correct. And let us hope they do not.
But I think it is reflective, however, of an attitude that is very strong, which is the government, the regime had miscalculated with strategic patience. And as a result, perhaps there's a bit of an over correction to it by thinking that, even this ceasefire was actually problematic. They should have gone further, even though at this point there was no strategic patience being exercised beyond the fact that the Iranians had to pace themselves because they initially thought that this would be a longer war.
Right.
I think with what we've heard during the war and after the war, Iran didn't ask Russia or China to help them. And even as Trita mentioned, the acts of resistance didn't do anything during the war. Ambassador, do you feel that Iran somehow, I think in the initial hours of the attack, it was a surprise attack and they wanted to change the regime, the so-called regime change in Iran. But it seems that as time went by during the conflict, Iran was much more confident that they can do something, just they don't need anybody to help them. That's why the Russian president said during the war, he said they didn't ask anything from us. He said specifically to the press in Russia. What's your understanding in that?
Well, I find it confusing, frankly. I think that was then, this is now. I strongly suspect that China and Russia, to the extent it can, are now assisting Iran in the rapid buildup of or reconstruction of defensive capabilities. But I think during the war, or before the war, Iran was a prisoner of its own fantasies about making a deal with the United States. And it didn't want to get further in bed with Russia in particular, given American attitudes. That was probably a misjudgment on Iran's part. But anyway, I think now the situation is different.
Nima, you're on mute.
I think Trita is going to leave us and he has something to do. Thank you so much, Trita.
Thank you so much,
today.
Nima,
Great
and
pleasure
Chaz, as always. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Sorry I have to leave early.
See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't think I have much to add to what Trita said.
Yeah.
That was quite a brilliant analysis of the factors going into this. I think there will be an effect from whatever happens in Alaska this evening. And that is to say, one very likely outcome is a complete end of American support for Ukraine. Because there are people in the administration who basically take the attitude that Europeans should counter Russia to free the United States to go after China. And therefore, the US should disengage from this proxy war in Ukraine. I'm not very confident about the outcome because, as I said, I think there's no common understanding of what the issues are. President Trump seems to still be focused on and prepared to be judged by whether or not he can achieve a ceasefire. And that is what Ukraine wants because it's losing the war. I don't think the Russians are prepared to offer a ceasefire, except in the context of a broader understanding about the future and peace and stability in Europe as a whole. Or in other words, I think the problem is that the United States and the West seem to conceive of this issue as all about Ukraine, and the Russians see it all as all about their security and stability and peace in Europe as a whole. And therefore, therefore we talk past each other. I hope Mr. Trump, President Trump is sincere about wanting to listen to what Vladimir Putin says, because I think that is the key to coming up with answers to this, not necessarily conceding things to Vladimir Putin, but recognizing that Vladimir Putin already has lots of things, and he's not going to give them up. And that is certainly the territorial issue. So those meetings could result in, as you suggested, in freeing up the American military-industrial complex to resupply Israel on a faster basis than would otherwise be able to do that. So I think there are lots of things in motion, and we really can't tell, but I fear Trita is quite right about Israeli desires to restart this war.
We know that Donald Trump he hates to play with a losing hand, and all he has in the meeting that with Vladimir Putin is a losing hand. But he has to just make up the situation the way that he's not a weakened position and all of that. But when you look at the administration going into the meeting and Donald Trump says that he's going to push for ceasefire, do you think that he's going to achieve something in that direction?
I doubt it. In fact, in many ways, the way this seems to be structured on the American side is true to President Trump's and Howard Lutnick's background as real estate brokers. So basically, it's being dealt with as a property swap, swapping plots of land. But that's not the issue at all. The issue was about minority rights in Ukraine. And of course, the unfortunate history of the Minsk Accords looms in the background. The Russian attack on Ukraine was not about Ukraine. It was about peace in Europe and the absence of a military threat on Russia's borders. It was exactly parallel to the American response to the Soviet arming of Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States would not tolerate Mexico arming itself against the United States in association with China or Russia or anyone else. And Russia is no exception to that. So the failure to understand this is an obstacle to dealing with the issues. If you could find a way to reassure the Russians that the threat from the West was contained, that it would not expand, and to deal with the Russians, for example, as Vladimir Putin has said he wants to do, by restarting arms control discussions and building a broader cooperative relationship, then maybe you could get somewhere. But if you just go in asking for a ceasefire and talking about property swaps, I don't think you get anywhere. I hope I'm wrong.
Did you watch Scott Besson on Fox News? He was talking about Europeans, and he had some harsh words for them to address them. Here is what he said, Ambassador.
It is time for our European counterparts to put up or shut up. They keep saying, oh, the U.S. should do this, U.S. should do that. President Trump has put secondary sanctions or secondary tariffs on India because of their consumption of Russian oil, and the Europeans haven't done that yet. As a matter of fact, the Europeans are buying the refined products that the Indian refiners make. So we need some coordination here. So if we are going to have a united front, which will give President Trump maximum leverage, then I think that our European counterparts need to do their part.
Well, he uses the word coordination, but what he means is subordination. That is to say, the Europeans have to do their part. In other words, they have to line up behind the United States. But there's no consultation with the Europeans about American policy. It is unilaterally derived and imposed. And I think, I have no great respect for the Europeans' position on issues like Ukraine, or for that matter, Iran, which is basically subservient to the United States, to the Biden administration's approach, and now to President Trump. But I would note there's one other thing that Treasury Secretary Besant has said, and that is these fictitious promises of major investments from Japan and Europe in American industry. He says basically, this gives us the right to tell Europeans where they should invest their capital and direct their foreign investments. I think that is a ridiculous assertion of imperial privilege, which will get us nowhere. I don't believe it for a minute. And I also don't believe that the promises that were made, or what we claim were made, because it's not clear that the other side agrees that they were made, are going to get implemented. So, impossible promises. Look at the China trade deal in the first Trump administration. The major effect of that was to build the Brazilian soybean industry to the level that it now is. The Chinese did not feel comfortable relying on the United States, given our erratic performance. So I think Mr. Besant, Treasury Secretary, is a very loyal apparatchik. I think he would have done very well under Joseph Stalin, speaking for the Soviet Union. I'm sorry to see an American leader speak such questionable words.
Well, what's so amazing to me, Ambassador, that the Trump administration showed no ability to communicate with Europeans so far. There is nothing there. I don't know who's talking with Europeans, who's communicating with Europeans, but it has totally failed so far.
Well, the major point of contact for the Europeans has been the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who has essentially insulted them and alienated them. I think Secretary of State Rubio has also made an effort, but it has been one-sided. He lectures the Europeans. He doesn't listen to them. You can't conduct a diplomatic relationship in that way successfully. And I think we're about to see, we are working our way toward a situation in which people basically say, the hell with the United States. Let's go on and do what is in our interest. And if the Americans oppose us, too bad. They're going to hurt us anyway. Do a trade deal with Donald Trump, and the next day he puts more sanctions on you. Look at India, which Treasury Secretary Besant condemned for its longstanding, reliable relationship with Russia. This is nothing new. It's been going on for decades. What is new is a punitive action by the United States. And the result of that, as we've seen, is an intensification of the Indian relationship with Russia, the National Security Advisor from India going to Moscow, telephone call between Narendra Modi and Vladimir Putin, a visit by Vladimir Putin soon to India, the Narendra Modi going to Shanghai to meet with Xi Jinping and others in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and no capitulation by India, by Brazil, by anyone, and even Japan beginning to talk about how it can divorce its reliance on the United States. So this is inept, amateurish, stupid, and counterproductive.
Ambassador, I don't know if you heard Netanyahu talking about appeasement and his behavior. It shows that here is what he said. I'm gonna ask my question after the video.
Talk to you about appeasement then and appeasement now. Before World War II, the Western countries tried to appease Hitler. He said, just give me a piece of Czechoslovakia and I'll make peace with you. And they cowed, and they bowed, and they yielded. And they gave Hitler a piece of Czechoslovakia, and you know what happened next. Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia and then started the worst war in the history of the world, World War II. Well, today the West is telling Israel, just give the Palestinians a piece of Israel and they'll make peace with you. No, they won't. For the last century, they've been offered a state of their own, and they refused because their goal is not to create a state for themselves, it's to destroy the state of ours, the Jewish state. That's their national goal. So we're not going to commit national suicide. We will not bow to foreign critics who lack the courage to face their own enemies, yet lecture us on how to face ours. We will not reward terror. We will defeat it. And the Jewish people will live free, strong, eternal in our land.
I would like to know exactly when Palestine was offered. The Palestinians were ever offered a state of their own. I don't agree with his analysis of appeasement. It depends on who you are appeasing. Hitler is one thing. Appeasing Israel by accepting its conquest of the Golan Heights or its occupation of parts of Lebanon and Syria is a bad example that Mr. Netanyahu would never cite of why appeasement of the wrong enemy is wrong. But an enemy with limited objectives, with a reasonable claim to things, can be offered concessions, which is not appeasement, it is an incentive. And interestingly, the most vigorous defense of appeasement, so-called, as a diplomatic tool was Winston Churchill, who said, you should appease those when you are strong, not when you are weak. You should take advantage of your strength to solve long-term problems with short-term concessions. So I think Mr. Netanyahu is a propagandist, a brilliant propagandist, and he is mouthing a typical interpretation of the Munich Accord with Chamberlain, which has some merit, but which is far from a complete analysis of what happened.
Ambassador, do you feel that Donald Trump, if we assume, I think impossible to assume he's going to be able to do something in Ukraine, but if we assume he would do something positive in that direction in Ukraine, how is that going? If the outcome was positive, how is that going to influence? You mentioned that he's somehow desperately is looking for a Nobel Peace Prize, and he's asking other presidents, prime ministers to write a letter and suggesting him to be a candidate.
He even called the Norwegians and asked for the prize. No, I mean, this is of course absurd, but the questions that Ukraine raises are about peace and stability in Europe. They are about assurances from Russia to Ukraine and to the rest of Europe that are credible or not. They are about assurances from the rest of Europe to Russia that are credible or not. Crafting that kind of framework is how you bring the war in Ukraine to an end. And I think essentially, the Russians would be happy with a relationship with Ukraine that was similar to the one the United States had with Canada before Mr. Trump decided to annex Canada, which I don't think Vladimir Putin has any intention of annexing Ukraine. He wants the Russian-speaking part of it, because that is the only way he can be confident that Russian speakers have protection from ultranationalists in Western Ukraine. So we'll see. It's entirely possible that a miracle will happen at Anchorage and the war will be over, but I very much doubt it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Well, thank you.